Last year, brain rot was named the Oxford Word of the Year for 2024.
The elite Oxford University Press has come up with its Word of the Year, and it is brain rot. If you have it, you know it, that kind of bizarre, semi-unintelligible online language, but officially defined as, get ready for it, the supposed deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state, especially viewed as the result of overconsumption of material, now particularly online content, considered to be trivial or unchallenging. In other words, to avoid brain rot, stop scrolling.
To me, that's a perfect snapshot of where we are as a culture. Social media addiction, short form content, and being chronically online have become our default state. So today I want to propose a radical solution: get offline and into a great book. Before Hollywood blockbusters and pop music dominated our cultural references, there was something else, a shared inheritance of great works from the greatest minds of Western civilization.
Think of the famous opening lines of very famous novels, like Charles Dickens' The Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Everybody knows that line. It's a great opening line. Or Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a young man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife. The opening line of Moby Dick, call me Ishmael. So you have all these great opening lines. Well, the opening line to Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars is very, very famous. And it's famous because everybody had to read it. So everybody knew the opening line to Caesar's Gallic Wars in Latin. Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts. And because everybody knew this and everybody recognized that this is part of the stock of your mental furniture, part of the common cultural consensus, we have the interesting spectacle of this becoming the sort of thing that people can allude to. This is part of what happens in literature, in educated cultures. People who write books now reflect the things that they've read, and so you have there was a book in the early 20th century called Cheaper by the Dozen, and a famous old movie based on this, about his big family in the early 20th century and living on the East Coast. Cheaper by the Dozen, and there's this eccentric, very interesting, charismatic father and 12 kids, so Cheaper by the Dozen. Well, one of the children who wrote this book, upon which the movie was based, and you've probably seen the movie, but in the book, and this is left out of the movie, in the book, she says, father, like Gaul, was divided into 3 parts. And then she talks about the 3 aspects of his personality. And because everybody in the early 20th century America would have read their Caesar in Latin, they would get the joke and chuckle, ah ha ha. They recognize the allusion to a famous book that every school child has to study.
This classical liberal education created a culture tied to a 3,000-year-old conversation. Dr. Robert Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago, captured this beautifully in his essay, The Great Conversation. His idea was simple, but profound. The great books of the Western tradition, when read chronologically, form a 3,000-year dialogue about the most important questions of human existence. This concept inspired Encyclopedia Britannica's Great Books of the Western World collection. Hutchins and Mortimer Adler oversaw this project, with Adler pushing it even further by inventing an entirely novel research tool, the Syntopicon. More on that in a minute. My journey to the great books. It was 2019 when I stumbled across Wes Callahan's video tour of his personal library.
These are my books. I have them in chronological order, starting with the ancient works here. I've got some works of the Egyptians, some Babylonian epics, but really this is where the Greeks start. Here's the Iliad, here's the Odyssey, commentaries, so I've got 3 shelves of Homer. This is my favorite. See how worn it is? It concludes about here, so I've got nearly as much Roman work as I've got Greek literature. And I'm trying to keep everything chronological from the beginning to the end. And so the authors are organized not by a last name or by any other system except where they fell in history. So the later authors are going to be later on my shelves. And that way, as I run my fingers along the spines of my book, my fingers are tracing the leaves of time. Up on top, I have a set of what most people know of as the Great Books, the Encyclopedia Britannica Great Books set published by the University of Chicago, Mortimer Adler, and those fellows who put together this set in the early and mid 1900s as a way of preserving what was being lost in American culture, this idea that there are great books. And so here's a 54-volume set of what Mortimer Adler and the other people at the University of Chicago thought were the greatest works of Western civilization. But there's an interesting contrast between this set and the books I've been panning my hands over down here. These are my great books, and these are Mortimer Adler's great books. And here's the difference. If we look up at this set, I can find Ptolemy, I can find St. Augustine here. And Augustine lived around 1400. The very next book is Thomas Aquinas, who lived after 1200. From 1400 to 1200 is 800 or 900 years. That's a huge gap. And after Thomas Aquinas, we've got Dante and Chaucer and the works of the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Modern Age. So the Modern Age starts not even halfway through this set. What was lost in this gap? Well, in this gap, there are these books. And this case that I showed you earlier contains just a tiny sampling of the works of the Middle Ages, which are immensely important. The works of the early Church Fathers, the works of Isidore and of Bede, the Venerable Bede, who is the greatest historian of English history. In fact, one of the only, certainly a primary source of English history. Beowulf. We've got the works of St. Anselm, who's one of the greatest of the medieval Christian theologians before Thomas Aquinas, the Golden Legend. There's a vast, vast number of books from the Middle Ages that are not represented in Adler's collection here. There's this 800-year silence, this gap between Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. And I think that's because this set is influenced by Enlightenment thought. The Enlightenment thinkers, by and large, had the idea that the Middle Ages, being characterized by Christian faith, were a dark age. Now, people have never thought of darkness in terms of, when they're thinking about cultures, they've never thought of darkness in terms of religion. They've never thought of darkness in terms of technology. In the Middle Ages, there was certainly poor technology, but there was the life of the mind was flourishing tremendously. If you look back at Golden Age Athens in the 400s, if we could walk the streets of Athens during the time of its Golden Age, when there are great thinkers, historians and poets and dramatists and mathematicians and geometers and so on, we would see very simple streets and whitewashed houses. There was not high technology, but the life of the mind was flourishing. Well, in the Middle Ages, there wasn't much high technology either. I suppose the average village in medieval Europe didn't look that much different from ancient Athens. But in the same way, the life of the mind was flourishing. In the High Middle Ages, when you have Thomas Aquinas writing the Summa Theologica and Dante writing his Divine Comedy, and Gothic cathedrals being built, there is no way that you can sanely say that was a dark age. There was a short dark age after the collapse of the Roman Empire 800 or 900 years earlier. But the Middle Age was not a dark age, unless you think that being characterized by Christian faith is darkness, and that's what the Enlightenment thinkers thought. The Middle Ages is this 1,000-year stretch of Western history, of Western culture, that was dominated by belief in the Scriptures and in the Christian Church and in the reality as described by the Bible. And the Enlightenment thinkers of the 1700s were men who were beginning to reject revelation as a source of meaning and truth and significance and adopting reason. Now, Christianity has never rejected reason, but reason always works with revelation. Reason is guided by the revelation of truth that God gives us. But the Enlightenment thinkers are beginning to reject that, and consequently they reject an age that trusts in Christian revelation. So I think that explains this odd and rather shocking gap in this great book set. There is no medieval literature in here between Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, whereas I've been able to accumulate, and this is pitiful compared to some libraries, I've accumulated several bookcases full of medieval literature that show the astonishing variety and the richness and the profound thought of medieval literature. So the Old Western Culture series that I've been lecturing about, and the Great Books courses that I teach online attempt to remedy that. There's far more than could be easily taught in a year out of the Middle Ages. In fact, I think we could safely say there are vastly more books written in the Middle Ages that have survived to us than books that have survived from the Greek and Roman worlds. So our emphasis on Greek and Roman culture in modern times also is is an inheritance of Enlightenment thinking, as is our ignorance of the Middle Ages. So I hope that my bookcases have attempted to remedy that balance.
That was my first encounter with the great books of the Western world. This idea that you could collect and read through the greatest works of our civilization in chronological order, tracking the development of ideas and spending time with the greatest minds in history. I was sold immediately. This became a lifelong pursuit. There was just one problem. The set, The Great Books of the Western World, it cost over $1,000, way outside my book budget. So I did what I had to do. I found lists online and slowly started collecting individual works, mostly used, starting with the Greeks. And a little bit of a tangent, but here's something that shocked me. My local library didn't even have a copy of the Odyssey. I was naive enough to think that libraries maintained a canon of essential books. Nope. They only keep what's popular and regularly being checked out. In fact, in the 6 years since I first went looking for Homer, they've replaced the classic section with manga, graphic novels, or Japanese comic books. But I kept searching for complete sets, checking prices over the years. Then, this past January, I found one near me for $150. I messaged the seller immediately and drove down to pick it up. Like new condition, he'd never read any of them. The only missing pieces were the 2 volumes containing Shakespeare's complete works, which I found on eBay that same day, and Hutchins' introductory essay on The Great Conversation. After some research, I learned that the second edition originally came with a companion volume, The Great Conversation, A Reader's Guide to the Great Books of the Western World. Now, this was a coffee table book, and it's an absolute treasure. It starts with the contents and a chronology of authors. Then Adler revisits Hutchins' original essay in The Great Conversation Revisited. There's a chapter on the 20th century additions to the set, suggestions for readers, and here's what really got me: an author-to-author index showing which previous works inspired later ones, plus an author-to-idea index. These indexes brilliantly illustrate the concept of the Great Conversation. The book concludes with a 10-year reading plan and a list of the great ideas. Tracking down this volume did take effort, but it's a fantastic introduction to the collection, and I highly recommend it. Now, the Syntopicon. These 2 volumes are what ultimately sold me on buying the complete set. I was already building my own collection of individual books, but the Syntopicon was something I'd always wanted because it's an incredible research tool. It effectively transforms the great books into an encyclopedia of ideas.
In 1947, at Chicago, Hutchins and I established the Great Books Foundation, which was an agency for spreading the reading of the great books to adults throughout the country, and still going on. And then in 1952, after Mr. Benton, Senator Benton, acquired an Encyclopedia Britannica from Sears Roebuck, he came to Mr. Hutchins and me and said, would you, he couldn't get the books. During the wartime, Every Man Library's editions, modern library editions, Pelican books were not in print. And Benton couldn't stand going to a library, and I think he's right. You can't mock up library books. You can't read without mocking books up. So he said to Hutchins and me, will you publish the set? And Hutchins' reply was, no, I will not. Why not, said Benton. And Hutchins said, because I know you're a salesman and the Britannica can sell them. No doubt about that. People will buy them, put them on the shelf. There'll be furniture in an American home, and I'm not interested in providing furniture for the American home. Unless there's some way of getting those books off the shelf and people to read them, I don't want to do it. Benton's face fell, and I said, give me 2 weeks, and let me see if I can come up with something to solve this problem. That was 1940, after 43. In 43, I wrote a book called How to Think About War and Peace. And I had an extraordinary experience. In research for that book, I went back to the great books to find passages in them about war and peace. And I found again and again in books that I had read before, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Hegel, Kant, so forth, I found on pages which I had marked passages I'd never seen before. How did I miss them, I said. And the answer was, you mark the passages which where you have a question in mind. obviously didn't have the question about War and Peace in mind when I read these books before. So I said, if you read the books over and over again with every possible question in mind, you could really find out what their content was. That is the origin of the Syntopicon. When Hutchins said, yes, that will do it. And Benton said, how much will it cost to do it? And I said, oh, well, how much time? I could do it in 2 years, perhaps $55,000. Ben said, go ahead. 8 years later and $1.5 million later, I produced the Syntopicon, which is a 2-volume index to the great ideas and the great books. And it makes the great books not just a collection of books, but a set of books talking about the same ideas in which the great conversation occurs.
Here's how it works. It covers 102 fundamental ideas. Each idea gets an introductory essay by Adler himself, covering its historical development, followed by an outline breaking it into about 10 topics and subtopics. Then comes the magic, a reference section listing the exact pages in the great books where you can find each topic discussed. This is the Syntopicon's power. It lets you research an idea in depth across the source material, following its evolution through 3,000 years of thought. Each idea also includes a cross-reference section to related concepts and an additional reading section for works outside of the Great Books collection. This pattern repeats for all 102 ideas, covering over a total of 3,000 separate topics. The Syntopicon ends with an extensive bibliography and an inventory of terms, essentially a master index of additional ideas with references to relevant chapters and topics. It's designed to let you see what the great books say about virtually any significant concept. Now, the great books themselves. Before coming to the project, Hutchins made one thing clear. He did not want these books to become household furniture. He wanted them to be read and used. I've owned this set for a year now, so have I actually used them, or have they just become expensive decoration? So, here's what I've read. First, Hutchins' original essay, The Great Conversation. Next, the revised companion volume, which I've already said I highly recommend, specifically if you have the second edition. It delivers the inspiration of the original essay plus visual chronologies and indexes that really drive home the importance of the Great Conversation. From the great books themselves, I've read the 10 books of Plato's Republic. I've read Demosthenes and Cicero from Plutarch's Parallel Lives, and currently I'm wrapping up Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. I've also worked through several ideas and topics in the Syntopicon itself. As someone with a full-time job and a growing family, I think I'm getting solid use out of this collection. Your mileage may vary depending on really your reading level and your time available for reading, of course. And most of my reading this year specifically has been outside of this collection. But the point is, I'm using it. Like any ambitious project, this collection has its flaws. To fit the many works included in this 60-volume set, they had to make the type very small. It's really small. Now, personally, I'm blessed with good eyesight, so the font size doesn't bother me that much. But many works, specifically like The Brothers Karamazov, are printed in 2 columns per page. So when you open the book, you're effectively reading 4 pages for every physical page turn. Probably given the font size, you're actually reading more. I actually had to create a special bookmark just to keep track of where I was on the page. The small font doesn't affect my eyes, but it did mess with my head. I had to recalibrate my sense of progress. With normal pages, each page turn is a little victory, a feeling of forward momentum. With the great books, you have to earn each page turn. Obviously, these take up serious shelf space. 60 volumes. But personally, I don't see that as a con, given what you're getting. And if you have limited space like me, I think it's a no-brainer because they function as a complete reference library. Finally, I think investing in physical books is an investment in yourself and your family. Yes, there's the educational value, but more importantly, physical books say something about who you are. They signal to others and to your kids that you're someone who cares about education and ideas and the pursuit of knowledge. Having physical books in your living space tells your children that books matter in this family. And when you surround yourself specifically with great books, you're subtly saying we hold ourselves to a higher standard. Over time, as we model what it means to engage with the great books, we can begin to participate in that 3,000-year conversation ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, we can get others around us to put down their phones and stave off that brain rot and choose to read a great book instead of doom scrolling their lives away. Thanks for listening, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel, and please leave a comment below. One of the main reasons I enjoy making these videos is to read the comments. So let me know, what are you currently reading? Do you think the great books of the Western world is still worth picking up in 2025? Let me know. Thanks for watching. That's all.
So I've been asked how the reading of the great books has affected me as a person. I suppose the best way to begin is by saying that, I'm not going to say that reading the great books has changed me in the way that life in Christ has changed me and so on, but it certainly has made a difference in what kind of person I think I am as compared to what I would have been if I hadn't been a student of the great books. The first and most obvious way is that reading the great books, the literature and the history of the past, reading the great books has given me a perspective. In nearly 15 or 20 years of speaking at conferences, a common theme that I talk about is the value of the great books. And an example that I've used in almost every talk I've given is the example of the maps that I used to read in my father's study when I was a little boy. I can remember opening up his giant map book on the floor, turning back the pages, and getting down on the floor and poring over these large-scale topographic maps, seeing where my house was, and where my grandparents lived, and where the nearby river where we went fishing was, and where our town was, and I remember distinctly feeling something growing in me that I now recognize was an understanding of my place in space, in geography, a person who's traveling likes to have maps or his GPS on his phone or in his car, because he wants to know not only where he's going, but where he is and what's in between where you're going and where you are. You like to know your location in space. You like to know where you are, see the world around you, and maps did that for me. So when I was young, I looked at my father's maps, and I began to develop an awareness of my place in space. And then later, when I was in junior high or high school, a teacher was in the habit of drawing timelines on the chalkboard, and she would say, now here's where Julius Caesar lived, and Shakespeare here, and Jesus Christ here, and Newton and Einstein here, and Abraham back here, and so this teacher would put various figures on the timeline, and I began to develop an understanding and an awareness of the distances that separated various people. And then me, on the far right end of the timeline, I'm so far from Shakespeare, so far from Julius Caesar, so far from Alexander the Great. And I began to develop an appreciation for my place in time, just like the maps had given me an appreciation for my place in space. So what the maps had done for my geographical awareness, the timelines and understanding of history, began to do for my chronological awareness. And I think that's one of the greatest things that the great books have done for me. They've given me a continuing appreciation of where I am in time.